Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second session where we are focusing on selecting a methodology and a research design in qualitative research. So we started with our conversation on Tuesday, and today we're going to then continue where we left off on Tuesday. So I'm going to share my screen without wasting any more time so that we can start with our session for today. Right. I hope you can all see the screen. Yes, as I've indicated, we are continuing on focusing on methodology and research design within the qualitative framework. Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to do quickly as a follow-up to the conversations that we had on Tuesday was that there were a number of questions that were raised that we didn't get time to attend to, but there was also one where I had promised, and I hope that the student is here today. Otherwise, I'm sure they'll see the recording, who had asked the question, and I had promised to come back after I find out about it. So the first question was, what is the difference between transect walk and observation? And transect walk an option of gathering spatial data. So it's also a form of observation, but somewhat different. So I guess the clue here is in the word walk, where you're walking, but with a very specific purpose, and also looking at recording not only your observations, but being very specific about the paths wherein you move as a researcher, and those playing a role in you collecting your data. So that is what the transect walk is about, whereas with observation, it's the act of observing, right? And being observed. Whereas with transect walk is, again, the idea of spatial. So how you use space, walking up the stairs or down the stairs, and how you record your moves in terms of you observing. So all of those things then count towards the data that you collect. And then the issue of sampling theory. And the question was, what is sampling theory? So sampling theory is a field of statistics that is involved with the collection, the analysis, and the interpretation of data gathered from a random sample of a population under a particular study. Right. And another question was whether there is data saturation within quantitative research. And I said I will respond to that today, but limited data saturation is limited to qualitative research. Because remember, it's about trying to get as much data as possible on a particular issue. But after you've spoken to a number of participants, when you start hearing the same narrative, the same story, then you know that, okay, there is nothing new that's going to come out of this data, which is very different from when you're doing a quantitative study, because you do a survey or you send out questionnaires to hundreds of people. So the amount of data that respond to your survey or that actually take up the questionnaire that you've given to them. So it's going to be dependent on who responds to the questions that you've put out. Whereas with interviewing, it's an active act on your side, where you actually schedule an interview, sit down with the interviewee, and go to the next interview and go to the next interview. So it's that conscious decision that you have to make. So the whole process of data collection of how one goes about collecting the data is very different between qualitative and quantitative research. So that is why then data saturation would be limited to qualitative research, because of the nature of how the data is collected. All right. I hope you can still hear me. Some scholars use the words interchangeably. So they would say an interview guide or a questionnaire. And often a questionnaire you would use when you're using very structured interviews or interview schedule. Then that can also be referred to as a questionnaire. So the answer is yes. And of course, also when you're doing descriptive studies using a Likert scale, for example, where the data that you're going to get is very descriptive, which is linked to qualitative research, they also questionnaires come in as well. Okay, so when you are doing your interviews, it's also then very important to think about the structuring of your interview guide. Think very seriously about the questions that you're going to be asking during your interviews. So read the literature. Right? Read the literature before developing your guide. I said it's always very important for you to base the kinds of questions that you ask, the kinds of claims that you make based on what exists in literature, so that you can be able to say, this is missing, here is the gap, this is how I'm entering the conversation, and you can only do that if you have engaged with literature. So read the literature, because that will also assist you in terms of ways in which you can frame your questions, right? What specific information are you looking for from this interview, right? Go back to your research question, go back to your objective. What kind of questions should I ask the participant for me to be able to get answers to my research question? And it's very important that you use open questions, right? Make sure that you try by all means to avoid asking questions that are going to lead to a yes or no answer, because that's not going to assist you to be able to get understanding of a particular phenomena that you're interested in. So if you ask a person and they just say yes, so what do you make of that then as the researcher? So don't put yourself in that position where it's going to be difficult for you to answer your research question. And do not use leading questions. Right? Don't ask questions that are going to lead your participants in a particular direction. So make sure that you ask open questions. Make sure that you ask questions that are going to allow the participant to respond in the way that they want to respond, not based on what the question is already leading them to. And the first set of questions must be broad questions. So if you think about at the beginning of the interview, trying to make the person feel at ease and relax. So demographics, for example, asking a little bit about who the person is, the broad information about who the participants are before you delve deeply into issues that, depending on what you're looking at, can make people uncomfortable. So you don't want to make your participants feel uncomfortable, right? So start from the broad and narrow and go down to the narrow. The middle section is where you now focus, specifically zoom in on the particular ideas in depth. You can also use probes from the first set of questions. So a broad question at the beginning, and then from that broad question, you can follow up, right? So you're probing. This is how the person answered, and now you probe so that you can be able to get more specific answers as well. Okay, and then the sequence of questions linked to what we've just spoken about. Never begin cold, right? You might be anxious as a researcher, but the interviewee or the participant can also be anxious as well, right? It might be a stranger, someone you don't know, they don't know you as well. So you need to try and make sure that you create a calm environment so that the person can feel comfortable to be able to speak to you. Again, depending on what your focus is, some of the questions that you might be asking could be very intimate questions. And so before you get to asking your participant such questions, make sure that the person is feeling comfortable. So be warm, build trust, build rapport, never begin cold, because then a person can easily close off. All right. What is the purpose of the interview? The purpose of the interview is so that you can get answers, you can get responses that are based on people's experiences, you can get ideas around the perceptions that people have on a particular issue. So for you to be able to get that, you need to think about how you relate to your participants, right? I've spoken about the general questions first. And also it's important when you're thinking about the sequence of how you're asking your questions. It's always important to think about the present, which is something that comes easily to people. I can reflect easily about what I'm feeling now, what's happening right now, how work was today, my experience of being in that work environment. So focusing on the present is also very helpful, because moving from there, then you can think about, has things always been that way? How have things changed? How have things become better? What is it that you envision going forward? Right, so then you connect where the person is right now to where they come from, but also to the possibility of where they're hoping to go and the anticipation of how things could be. All right, so it's crucial to when you think about interview questions and how you structure your interview guide, that it's not just question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but it needs to be very well thought out, right? Because this is an empirical study. This is the engagement that's going to assist you to make meaning of a particular phenomena in life, right? So it's therefore very important to think about all these different steps very deliberately. Okay. Cover essential issues right at the beginning. Get as much information as possible, and as the interview, the conversation goes, then you can also open up to the participant to start asking you questions, and to also just get their impression of how the process was for them, and if there's anything that you did not ask them that they would like to add as well, right? So it's important to remember that you even though it's a conversation and you're interviewing the participant, it's not the kind of conversation that you have with a friend or a family member. It's a very deliberate conversation, a structured conversation that has got a specific goal at the end, right? So in that way, then what I'm trying to say is that you have to make sure that you stay within what the research is about. There are some people or some participants that could sort of overtake and take over the interview, and they start asking you questions. So it's also very important to make sure that you find a way, but also not in a way that makes a person feel like you're cutting them off, but to find a way to bring the conversation back to the topic at hand. I've had experiences with students who come back and say, but it was very difficult for me because the participant was so talkative and they were talking and I felt like they're not asking or responding to what I was interested in. And so I'm not sure whether I got the data that I was hoping for. And so you can look at this in multiple ways. Sometimes the person uses that space to speak about that particular issue that maybe has actually been a thorn in their life or something that they've been reflecting on. And so they're seeing this as an opportunity for them to really express and share how they have been experiencing this particular issue, and that's great. So you think about how then the interpretation will happen, but it becomes a challenge if the conversation goes outside of the theme that you're interested in, because at the end, when you look at what you have in terms of the data, you may find that is not assisting you to respond to your research question. So at the core, at the heart of it, it's always very important to remind yourself that is this in line with my objectives? Is this assisting me to respond to the research questions? And of course, the practicalities now of doing the interview, right? You have to make sure that you've got enough battery life on your recorder. Otherwise, you might lose out on important information. If you're going to have an interview for an hour, even if you take notes, sometimes some things might be missing. So where possible, unless if it's in a place where it's not possible for you to record, but in instances where you are able to record, make sure that you have enough battery life, because you don't want your recorder to die while you are in the middle of an interview. That also speaks to poor planning. So you have to make sure that you plan very well. All right, and think about appearances as well. So you need to be respectful, right? And you need to be presentable, and you really need to think about context as well, right? So where are you going to be doing this interview? Whom are you going to be doing this interview with? So you have to make sure that you are presentable in how you then engage and how you present yourself before the participant. And issues of gender, issues of culture, issues of social differences are things that we should not take lightly. These are things that can actually make or break your interview. So what is the gender of the people that you're going to be interviewing, right? What is the age of the people that you're going to be interviewing, and reflecting on yourself as well. What is your age also? Maybe you're a 22-year-old and you're going to be interviewing elders, right? You're going to be interviewing people of a specific social standing or social class. You're interested in women in politics. So you are going to be interviewing ministers, right, who are in government, right? So how are you going to navigate that process, right? And what are the protocols that you need to think about, that you need to make sure that you are aware of before you go for the interview? So all those things, that planning, that pre-planning has to be in place before you go for the interview. And finding a comfortable place for interviewing is also very important. Right now, since 2020 with COVID, we're doing many of the interviews on Zoom. And so if you are going to be arranging an interview on Zoom as well, who as the participant, do they have access to data? Do they have access to the tools or gadgets that are necessary for them to connect to Zoom? Where are they based as well? We're living in South Africa, for those who are in South Africa, where we've got issues with load shedding. Planning around things like that are also very important. So finding a comfortable place for interviewing. You don't want to go and meet at a busy coffee shop somewhere, right? Because you want to avoid distractions as much as possible. So make sure that the place is convenient, make sure that the place is comfortable, make sure that the place is safe as well. It's very, very important that you feel safe as the interviewer at a place where you're going to be conducting the interview. All right, and control issues also in the interview. I've indicated that sometimes, again, issues of power, issues of social status. Who is it that you're going to interview, and how are you going to navigate and make sure that you create space and accommodate for the possibility of this power differential when you're having a conversation. You're interested in the experiences of CEOs in South Africa. CEOs are very busy, and CEOs occupy a particular space within society, within companies. So what are the possible power issues that you need to take into consideration if you're interested in a study like that? Okay. And of course, one of the first things you do is you explain the purpose of the interview. So even though maybe you've spoken to the person on the interview on the phone, they've agreed that they would be willing to be a participant in your study. But when you actually do the interview, you also have to, again, explain the purpose of the interview. And this, of course, is linked to making sure that you get informed consent. Do people really understand what the study is about and what is it that you're hoping to achieve and what's going to happen after you've conducted the study, right? And again, if you're going to be interviewing people like maybe ministers or people like CEOs, those are very, very busy people with very, very busy schedule. So it's important to clearly indicate how long the interview is going to take, because you don't want in the middle of the interview then have somebody saying that they need to go somewhere. So the dedicated time, which ideally should be planned ahead of time, is very important. So you're very clear that the interview is going to take an hour. So scheduling an hour in the person's diary so that they can make that time for you, so that you have an interview that's not disrupted, that does not have challenges along the way, right? And also all the information, and these are things that are linked to issues of ethics, again, informed consent, that after this interview, this is what's going to happen. These are the things that are going to follow, and the importance of confidentiality as well, so that a person can feel free, that they can share, and knowing and understanding that the interview after the data is not going to just be shared with anybody. All right. And I spoke about making sure that you have enough battery life, but before you can even use that recorder, you need to get permission for it. There are places where you're not allowed to use a recorder, and then there are participants who are uncomfortable with having the interview recorded. So it's at multiple levels, the idea of recording. So always keep that in mind, and think about how you can then with the ways in which you can maximize the time that you have with the interview, where you make notes, but you making notes not taking you away from actually physically engaging in the interview itself. Okay, so what are the characteristics of a good interview? After I've said this, you have to be clear about what the purpose is. You need to tolerate pauses, right? Give participant time to think. Do not be in a hurry to move from one question to the next. You've got 20 questions. You want to make sure that you finish your 20 questions. Sometimes you might only get to question 9 based on the in-depth nature in which the person is responding to your questions. And sometimes you might find that by question 4, when they respond to it, they're already touching on things that you were going to ask later on, right? And sometimes when you ask a question, a person might take time before they respond. So it's okay. Sit with the silence, right? Tolerate when the person is pausing. Don't rush to the next question, and don't rush them to answer. So sometimes a person might take a little bit of time to think about what you've just asked them. And again, depending on the theme or the topic, sometimes people do need to think about what you're asking them. And sometimes the question might be requiring a person to go back in time, right? And so they have to really reflect and think before they can give you the answer. So it's okay. Sit with that pause. And don't use jargon, right? Don't use jargon. We always say, when you're interviewing, or even when with your consent form as well, when you're engaging with participants, make sure that you use language that people can easily understand. We always say that, think of a grade 8 to grade 10 learner. Look at your interview schedule and ask yourself, can a grade 8 learner understand what I've written here? And if the answer is no, then you have to revise that interview schedule. Okay, so don't use jargon. for example, if you're interested in experiences of people who've had COVID before and you want to understand what that was like for them, and how many people and how people experienced other people distancing themselves from them and how they felt alone because of COVID and this idea. So you want to get an understanding of this idea of people being stigmatized just because they had COVID. So even after the isolation period, people are still a bit uneasy being around them because they think, what if maybe that COVID is still there? So the level of stigma that's there for people who've contracted COVID-19, for example. So, but when you're going to be interviewing people, you're not going to just assume that all of us understand what being stigmatized mean, what stigma is, right? So make sure that you try and unpack that and use a simpler language that people can then understand and not use phrases or concepts like stigma. How can you say it differently, right? Guide the participant on the structure of the interview so that they have an idea of the direction of where the conversation is going and how it's going to go, right? And always inviting comments. Is this clear? Are we still on the same page? Yeah, do you have any comment based on this particular issue that we've just discussed? Do you have any questions at the moment? And maybe you will still ask about them having questions at the end of the interview, but sometimes they might have questions during the interview, in the middle of the interview. So encourage that if there's a need for it, right? Use questions for prompts, right? I said tolerate pauses. So sometimes when a person is pausing for a very long time, you might want to prompt, maybe use a prompt, a question, a follow-up question, but link to the question that you've already asked so that you don't ask too many questions at the same time. So use questions as a way to prompt a person to respond to a particular question. Pay attention to body language, very, very important. Body language is as important as what the person is saying as well. Sometimes the body is saying one thing and the person, what they are actually verbalizing is another thing. So body language is also a form of data. So be able to read body language and see whether the person was uncomfortable or the way that they move their body and they looked sad, maybe with their eyes. So what is it that the body is also telling you during the interview? And this is something, unfortunately, that when you're doing an interview over the phone, or if you're doing it on Zoom, even though sometimes we can use video and see each other, it's not the same as when you're sitting with a person and engaging with them. And these are some of the things that you can reflect on as you interpret and write your results, on how you conducted the data and what are the implications of doing an interview over Zoom or over the phone vis-a-vis doing an interview in person. And steer the conversation, point out challenges and contradictions to your participants, if there are any, as a way to allow for some reflection. You know, earlier you said this, and now you're saying this, and I'm just wondering where, you know, how those two things connect, or whether maybe something happened and then there was a change or a shift. So if there are maybe some contradictions in that moment, find a way to try and maybe create an opportunity for engaging with those contradictions, and not make assumptions, because sometimes the contradictions happen during the interview, and then the student will only wait until they're sitting with the data to analyze and say, here are some contradictions. This could be the implication, this could be what that means. While you have the opportunity during the interview itself, try and engage those contradictions. And be able to interpret and summarize. So what I'm hearing you say is that it's very, very difficult to be a single mother, because it means you need to juggle so many things. A single working mother, it means that you need to do 1, 2, and 3, and all these things then make it very difficult for you to be able to do 1, 2, and 3. Right. So when you do that, it shows that you're listening, and it also gives the participant the opportunity to say, no, that's not what I mean, or that's not how I feel. So you just want to check that you're hearing the person correctly, so that you don't make assumptions that are going to lead to possible misinterpretations at the end when you're engaging with your data. And be balanced. Don't talk too much. So in the 1 hour, the 60 minutes, you don't want to be talking for 40 minutes of the hour, because the interview should ideally be about the participant and not about you. And if you're going to be talking for 40 minutes and the participant only for 20, then there's something wrong there. Right. And also don't talk too little, because you need to show interest. You need to show that you are present in the process. And part of doing this is also through, pointing out contradictions if there are any, summarizing and interpreting what the person has said in the moment, and giving it back to them. So you do that. And in that way, you're not just reading out questions, or you're not just asking questions. So this and that and that, and the person answers, oh, okay, thank you. And then this and that and that. So it's questions and questions and questions. You need to allow it to flow, so that there's a conversation between the two of you, always making sure that you keep the balance, so that there's enough time for your participant to respond to the issues that you're asking about. And of course, be ethically sensitive. Be sensitive to the issues that you're discussing. Be sensitive and show care. We speak about the ethics of care. That you're not just looking at the participant as someone that you're going to extract data from, but that you actually care about that particular issue. And that's why you're doing this study, because you are vested in this issue, because you're interested in this issue. And so your sensitivity should come through to show that you're not just doing this so that you earn a qualification. You're not just doing this so that you can be able to get the data to go and interpret, but that you're actually interested in the issue that you're investigating. Okay. So the questions themselves, they should be as neutral as possible. I said earlier, don't ask leading questions. So they should be as neutral as possible, and ask your questions one at a time. Don't ask 3 questions in one. So can you tell me this and that and the other? And then also indicate how it relates to this and that, and also how that then affected the way in which this and that happened. You see what I just did? So there's 3 points, 3 issues that you're asking all at the same time. So that can be confusing for the participant. So try and make sure that you structure your questions in a way that there is a central issue that each question attends to, and not 5 things all combined in one question. Okay, so that's not good question construction. And they should be worded clearly so that the participant is not confused, and that throughout the interview, they don't keep asking you, what do you mean? Can you explain that question? What exactly are you trying to say, so that I can be able to answer you? So try and have questions that are going to, as much as possible, avoid that. Okay, and try and not ask questions that are confrontational, that seem, to ask participants, but why did you do that? So the experiences of a former drug, why are you a drug addict, right? So you can still ask the question about how a person uses substances, but it's in also, again, how you're asking the question. So the framing of the question is very important. You still will get the same answer, but it's in how you frame the question that's going to make the participant not feel defensive and intimidated by the question that you're asking them. They should not feel judged by you, right? And follow up and clarify where necessary. And when a person is speaking, give them the opportunity to speak until they finish, even though maybe there's something that they've just said that you want to follow up on. Allow them to finish, don't interrupt. And when they're done, then you can probe, then you can ask a follow-up question, then you can ask them to elaborate on what they've just said. Right, and I've just said, don't be judgmental about, again, the person's beliefs. People have got different beliefs, right? And when you're interviewing people, you should not be judgmental. But why? Why is it that? That's very problematic. I do apologize. I think my network is a bit slow, but I hope we don't lose each other. And don't debate responses. Believe that what the participant is telling you is their lived reality. Don't debate with the participant about the response that they're giving you. Even though you might see things differently, remember that in qualitative research, you're interested in people's lived realities, right? You're interested in their perceptions. You're interested in their view of the world. So don't impose as they are responding to your questions. Okay, and just quickly here, some of the ways in which you can do this. So when you're thinking about your own research, what are some of the ways you can do what I've just spoken about, right? So the verbal and the nonverbal. If you are engaging to show that you are listening to a person, so without interrupting, then you can just nod. And the posture, the way that you're sitting together with the participant, it will show that you're interested. It will show that you are listening to them. It will show that you are with them in what they're saying, right? So the nonverbal is very, very important. And verbal also, exclamations. Oh, I see. Ah, okay. Okay. Yes. Yes. Oh, so those things are also very important. And sometimes when you say, oh, it can actually be a very beautiful prompt for a person to elaborate on what they're saying or to say it further. So you will say, oh, and then it'll be like, yes, because this and that and that and that. Yes, you know, this is how this and that happens. So sometimes just little prompts can actually be a pathway, right, to allow the participant to elaborate on what they're saying without you necessarily saying, can you elaborate more? Just saying, and then they go on. All right. And then how do you then engage where maybe you want your participants to elaborate more, to engage more, and you maybe have picked up some contradictions, like I said earlier. So how you can do it in a way that's not going to feel combative or that you're challenging them. You can phrase it like this. I don't quite understand. This is what you said, or this is what you're saying, but I don't quite understand. Can you perhaps tell me this and that and that, right? Or you've just indicated this and that and the other, but I'm still confused because when you said this, I was thinking that you meaning 1, 2, and 3, but I'm still confused, and I was wondering if maybe you can just clarify for me so that I can understand, right? So that we can be on the same page. And then another way of probing is to just simply ask the person, can you tell me more? You've indicated that it's very difficult. You don't have time for yourself. Tell me more about what that's like for you. In what ways is that affecting you, right? So can you tell me more? So what do you mean when you say this and that? So you throw it back to the participants so that they can elaborate. Okay. And then repeating a phrase, it could be also just like summarizing, like I said earlier. So using a word that the participant has used, again, shows that you're listening to them, but you're asking in a questioning tone, right? So it's difficult for me to juggle all these different things all at the same time when there's only 24 hours in a day. Oh, okay. So I see. So juggling is something that's difficult for you. So asking it in a way that can allow them to elaborate that, yes, because when I juggle so many things, then I can't focus properly. Then I can't give everything the attention that it requires because I'm already thinking of the next thing, or because I'm already rushing to the next thing. So that becomes a challenge for me in being able to manage certain things in my life, right? Okay, I spoke about the audio recording, and so you capture the interview, very, very important. And then after capturing the interview, you've recorded, it's very important that you transcribe, if possible, as soon as possible, so that the interview is still fresh in your mind. If you can transcribe yourself, I know it's a lot of work, and if you've interviewed 15 people and you have to transcribe, it's going to take a lot of time. But if your interviews are spaced in between, you're interviewing one person today, another tomorrow, another maybe next week, where possible, transcribe as soon as, don't wait for 15 interviews and then you transcribe. That's going to feel like an impossible task to do. And so when possible, do transcribe yourself. And of course, you can use someone else. So if you have a scholarship or you have a bursary or you have funds that are at your disposal, there are transcription services that are available out there. You can utilize those services. But it's very, very important that even if you use someone else for your transcribing, you still have to sit with that data. You have to listen to that recording, and you also need to sit with that transcription before you even start the coding. So you have to make sure that you check the transcriptions themselves. And as you do that, you can, annote here and there, add notes where possible, things that are sticking out for you. Start doing that. We know that there's also softwares like Atlas TI and Vivo that are very useful for coding as well. They are very useful, but still also as a researcher, you still need to engage with the data. Even if the codes are there, but you need to sit and make sense of those codes, make sense of that data. Right? They save a bit of time, but if you can transcribe yourself also, or you prefer to transcribe yourself, that's also very useful because it really allows you to immerse yourself in the data. Field notes, very important. So even though you're recording, make notes for yourself, personal notes that you can always go back to. Notes about how the interview made you feel, what are the things that stood out for you, the interview. So not necessarily the content of the interview, but things that stood out for you that maybe you want to go back and reflect on later on after you've collected the data. Right? And ensuring that pseudonyms are used. And here, again, it's also very important to engage with the participants. There are some participants that prefer their real names to be used. So it's something, again, that can be negotiated with the participants. I know when we apply for ethics clearance, often when you tick the boxes, it's there that you have to indicate that as part of privacy and confidentiality, you're going to use pseudonyms. But it's also very important to think about the implications of using pseudonyms in relation to whose story is it then at the end if you're using pseudonyms. So a conversation with the participants also around, for confidentiality, for privacy, I'm going to use a different name. I'm going to assign a name to you, or I'm just going to choose a variable, a letter that I'm going to ascribe to your story, and whether that's okay with the people or not. So it should really be a negotiated thing. All right, and that's linked to replacing identifying information. So if you did a study in a particular community, at a particular school, at a particular club, or at a particular what town. So what are the identifying indicators that when I read, I can immediately say, oh, so this is where that data was collected. So making sure that you try and remove those from the data so that those identifying information as part of ensuring privacy is attended to. Okay, and then performing member checks. So you've interviewed, you've collected your data, you've transcribed the data. So those transcriptions, it's very important that you take them back to the participant and say, is this a true reflection of the conversation that I had with you? And then you can get confirmation from the participants in that regard. Okay, so that was all information around interviews. And now we're going to move to another form of data collection, which is focus groups. Right, so focus group is also a form of interview, but it's different in that it's a form of interview that's conducted in a group setting, right? Where the conversation is happening among multiple or several participants all at the same time. Right, and it's very important that you do not treat the focus group as just another interview. If you're interested in interviews and speaking to people as individuals, then do individual interviews. If you're going to be doing a focus group, it's very important to understand what is the purpose of a focus group, what is it that it aims to achieve. And when you have that understanding, and when you've decided that, okay, based on my research interest and my aim, then focus groups are a perfect fit for me to collect data to be able to respond and achieve this aim that I have. All right, so within focus groups, there's something specific that you're interested in. You're interested in what happens when people are interacting with one another, right? You're interested in looking at the performance of the group when people are together speaking about a particular issue. You're interested in people's perceptions on a particular issue, right? And your role is that of a moderator. And you have to allow the conversation to flow in the group as people are engaging with each other, right? So you're looking at analyzing the group. So it's the content, what people are saying, but also the interaction in terms of what happens as people are interacting, the group dynamics. So the actual group is your unit of analysis and not the individuals in the group. All right, and you do a focus group if you're interested in a variety of opinions. What are people's opinions on a particular issue? Oftentimes, focus groups tend to be used by market researchers, right? So if there's a new product in the market and they want to get people's opinions on that particular brand or a particular product, then they would get people's opinions on that. So put a group of people together and say, what are your thoughts on this new brand? What are your thoughts on this new product that has been produced? Do you think the color works? Do you think the branding works? What are your thoughts? So that you can be able to say, okay, this product will actually be a success or it won't be a success. So it's usually easier in market research in that sense. In your research, if you're interested in people's perceptions on going back to work after COVID-19, then it's going to be a different kind of conversation and it's going to be a different kind of feedback that you get. Unlike if you say, here's a new brand of car, do you think the design of this car, the way it looks, the lights, all of that, do you think it works? It's very different from saying, okay, now we're not wearing masks anymore. Now we're not social distancing anymore. Do you think people should be going back to work full time? Right, so there are a lot of things that are involved there. So what are people's opinions? You're hoping to get that. You're hoping to get depth of information from there. So the perceptions in terms of how people see things, how they make sense of things. And it's also useful for exploratory initiatives. Like I said, if there's a particular thing, something that is new, something that is novel, and you want to get people's responses or feedback to it, focus groups are very good for that. And of course, within focus groups, there's a lot of group dynamics, right? Sometimes people can be shy, and so you need to strike a balance. You want to probe and maybe say, but okay, maybe this side of the group, what are your thoughts? What is it? Maybe this side has been saying a lot and this side hasn't. So what do you guys think there? What do you think? So probe, but probe in a way that's not going to make a person feel like they're put on the spot. Okay, I've spoken about group dynamics, and for focus groups also to be very effective, you don't want to have a huge group. You don't want to have too many people. So researchers have identified that if you have between 6 and 10 people in a focus group, it's a big enough group, but also on the other hand, small enough group for you to be able to have fruitful engagement where people don't disappear in a group. Because if you have a big group, it's very easy for other people to just become invisible and disappear in the group. And it also becomes very difficult for you to moderate the conversation in a big group like that. So smaller group, but still big enough to allow for engagement around people so that you have these variety of opinions and perceptions that people have on a particular issue. And I had promised that I'll come back to this. There was a question on Tuesday around focus groups. How many focus groups should one have for one study, for a particular study? And the number that you need to aim for is 3 or 4 focus groups, because sometimes if you're just going to have one focus group with 6 people, it might not be enough data for you to be able to come to useful interpretations and conclusions based on what you found, right? So if you have 3 or 4 groups of 6 or 8 people each, and it has been found that often beyond 4 groups, you start reaching saturation as well. You have a focus group and then you have a conversation on the theme and you start realizing that similar type of themes and conversations start happening. So that's when you know that, okay, I've reached saturation. All right. And then the group composition, who has to be in the group? Who are these 6 or 10 people? Avoid power differentials where possible. So what is the purpose of your study? What is it that you want to get? So who needs to be in that conversation for you to be able to get that kind of information that you need? For example, will the employees be open if the employers are in the room? Should you combine employees and employers in the same room? And what are the implications of that? So thinking about these things beforehand are also very important. Sometimes it is important for you to have the employees and employers in the same room so that you can be able to have that robust conversation, that there will be opinions based on the perceptions that the employees have, and on the other hand, perceptions that the employers have. So this space then putting people in a space where they can be able to speak about the issues related to your topic could actually be very useful. So sometimes that is important, but it's important for you to be aware. And if the group has got challenges or combining group people creates challenges around power differentials, then that might have a negative impact on the study and its findings. And again, strangers or acquaintances, putting people together, again, it's going to be determined by what it is that you're interested in, right? Is it going to serve you better to have strangers in the focus group? Is it going to serve you better to have acquaintances? What is it that can come out if people are acquainted with each other? What is it that can come out if people are strangers in terms of how they can be able to engage in a focus group, right? And the same thing again in terms of experts and novices, right? We're interested in issues around COVID. Are you going to have doctors and community members in the focus group having conversations about issues around COVID? Or are you going to have a group of doctors only speaking and people who might be novices also speaking? And what are the implications of that? And all of these, again, for you to determine who's going to be in your focus group will be determined by what is it that you're interested in? What is it that you're hoping to achieve? That is very important because that will then determine who becomes a participant in your focus group, right? You don't just decide because when you do that, you might not answer your research question. Okay. And stratify by salient characteristics, people's age, their gender, their race. Again, are you going to have a mix of people in your focus group? And is that mix going to assist you again? So you're interested in a variety, a diverse opinion, a diverse ideas that people bring in. And will younger or older people bring in more diversity? And what does it mean to have younger people who are 18 years old being in conversation with people who are in their 60s? What are the what implications? What does that mean? And if you think having an intergenerational dialogue will actually assist, then maybe that is the way to go. So stratifying your group according to particular characteristics is also something that you need to think deeply about, right? And then continuing, so when it comes to analysis, so how do you then analyze the data from the focus group? You analyze for content, what is it that is being said, right? But you also analyze for group dynamics and interaction. So what is it that was happening in that moment when people were interacting in the focus group? How does the group arrive at a collective opinion and voice? Are they in agreement on a particular issue? Are they not in agreement? And how is that conversation? How is that dealt with within the group in their conversation? And how are voices of dissent negotiated as well? So you have 10 people and 8 of them are saying, yes, yes, actually, that's how it is. But there are these 2 people that are saying, no, but actually it's not. I disagree with that. So how do you then reconcile that, right? Because those opinions are also very important. And what does that mean to have those people seeing things in a different way, right? Vis-a-vis those who are saying, no, but this is the way to go. And what informs that, right? So what are these voices? What informs them agreeing or disagreeing? And how does your influence as moderator affect group dynamics? And here we're speaking about issues on the importance of reflexivity. So how does me being in the space as a moderator influence? I am in the space and I'm a woman and I'm having this engagement with men, or I'm a man, I'm having this engagement with women, or I'm a young person and I'm speaking with people who are elders, I'm speaking with traditional leaders or traditional healers. And so what does that mean in terms of what I represent as I sit here and engage? So these are the things that you need to reflect and think about, right? And your own reflection in terms of how you're reading the group. What is it that's happening here? As I said, it's not only about content, what people are saying, but also how you're reading the room and how you're reading the group as well. What dynamics are you seeing there? All right, in terms of maybe gender. Is it more women who are saying this, more men who are saying this? What's happening? Not just what's being said. All right. And then trying to also then check and reflect on the voices that are coming forward. What are the dominant voices, right? What are the opinions that are coming? And these things are going to then form part of how you then analyze this data. And so in a focus group, how many questions should you have, right? 8 questions, or even 6 questions or 5 questions, because you're going to have this open engagement where many people might speak. So one question can actually take 20 minutes or 25 minutes with people debating, disagreeing, agreeing. coming up with ideas, different ways of looking at something. So it's unlike an individual interview where you have many voices. So you don't want to have 20 questions when you are doing a focus group, right? Very focused questions and making sure that those questions allow for conversation, open-ended conversations to take place, right? And the opening, just like with interviews, again, based on facts, what is happening, what is this about, and the introductory, where again you foster interaction and the importance of focusing on the topic, because sometimes when people start getting into it, they may go off topic as well. And then transitioning from that to the topic, to contextualizing, putting the topic that you're interested in context. Why is it important for us to be talking about COVID right now? Why is it important for us to be talking about the possibility of going back to work full time? What does that mean in terms of how people have now started thinking about what it means to work from home and what would it mean to go back to work? So what are the key questions that you're asking that you think will assist you to unpack this topic, this issue that you're interested in, right? And as much as possible, try avoiding giving examples because that might lead people, right? So don't give examples, stick to the questions. These are the questions, put forward a particular issue and then open up for conversation. And again, just like with individual interviews, as much as possible, avoid asking why, right? But why? Why do you do this? Why is it not a good idea to do that, right? Because people can become defensive, right? And then what can be useful also when you're doing focus group is using vignettes, right? Or a particular case. So giving a story and saying, here's a story. Here's someone who used to work, who used to be at their office full time, and then COVID happened, and now they're at home. And while they're at home, they realize that, oh, actually being at home, this is how my life has changed. So, and now I'm called to going back to work. What am I going to do? Do I resign because I don't see myself going to the office full time or not? So you give a little story and say, how would you respond to that, right? What are your reflections on this case that I've just presented to you? What are your thoughts? And then it opens up for conversation. Okay. And then the discussion guide design. So this is the kinds of themes or questions that you put together for your focus group. You focus on a particular issue and then you decide how you're going to then break it down, right? And as I've been saying, it's very important that the discussion guide be determined or guided by the research objectives that you have, right? The purpose is to provide direction for the discussion. That is why you have the guide, and you're going to be moderating the interaction. And I've already spoken about moving from the general to the specific. And then what are the characteristics of the guide, right? It's a tool that assists you as the moderator, the facilitator of the conversation, so that you know how to direct on how to facilitate the conversation, right? And depending again on the direction and the flow of the conversation, you can modify it. So it's not a strict structured, you cannot move away from it. So again, you are guided by the conversation and where it's leading you. All right. And the guide should allow an open for people to explore, and it should be phrased in a way that allows for in-depth conversations by the group. All right. And then I think just lastly here, the first few moments in the focus group are very critical, right? People should feel safe. You as the moderator have to set the tone so that people immediately start feeling safe, so that they start feeling free to share their own opinions, that each and every opinion matters, each and every opinion has got a place there. And so the ground rules in terms of people not shutting each other down, that people should give each other an opportunity to respond, is also very important. And then at the end of the focus group, you provide a summary, right? So these are the issues that came out. These are the issues that stood out. And would you agree that these are the issues? So you summarize and you check in with the group whether you've summarized appropriately. Okay. And lastly, also just asking for reflections from the group as well. Okay, participant observation, your researcher, you as the researcher, your role in observation is different. I spoke about this as a research design, and now I'm just going to touch briefly on it as data collection method, right? As a participant. So complete participation, complete participant observer rather, is where you conceal your role as a researcher. Your role is not known, so that's how you conceal. And then complete observer or non-participant, there's no participation on your side, right? You may even observe from behind one-way glass. I'm from the psychology discipline, and part of the work that has been done in psychology for many, many years is that we conduct experiments, right? And unlike the experiments in the natural sciences, where you're working with a lab with instruments and things, within psychology, the instruments are human beings, and sometimes the researcher can observe behavior through a one-way mirror to be able to see what happens when people are put in a stressful situation, what happens when you deprive people of 1, 2, and 3, and you leave them for 5 hours or you leave them for 10 hours, and then you observe what happens after a while when people start getting frustrated or when people are presented with something. So how is behavior affected by different things that trigger them in life? So many psychologists have done these kinds of experiments. So this is an example of how you can observe from behind one-way glass. And often the participants may not even know that they are being observed, right? So the types of observations, they vary. Completely structured, right? You employ an observation schedule. So in the example that I've just given in psychology, where you observe from one mirror, you can decide that you're going to observe at half an hour intervals, right? So there's an observation schedule. I'm going to observe at 1, and then I'm going to come back and see after 30 minutes if there's been any change, and then I'm going to observe after an hour. So there's an observation schedule. And if you are in the field, for example, doing ethnography, it could be a different kind of schedule that you employ, right? And only specific aspects are observed. So what is it that you're interested in? Again, your topic. When you are observing a community, you're not going to be observing everything. So maybe you are interested in particular rituals that people perform at a certain time in a day or a certain time in a week. So specific things are observed and not everything. So there is an aim to your observation, right? Yeah, structured and to unstructured naturalistic observation. So it's not focused only on specific aspects, but it's focused on understanding the culture of a people, for example. So that would involve multiple aspects of how people make meaning of the world and they go about their everyday. So it would involve everything. And this is usually the kind of research that people in anthropology do or would have done in the past. So going and spending a year in a particular community and just learning about how people live, right? So what are some of the ethics to think about and consider when you're doing observations? The importance of informed consent. Informed consent came about because of the kind of research that some researchers and scientists were doing, which were unethical, right? Either on people's bodies, but also where people don't know that they're being watched, and at the end, interpretations and conclusions are going to be made about people's lives without them knowing, right? So the concealed role of a researcher is quite tricky. It entails deception, because if people don't know the purpose of you being there, then there's an element of deception there, right? And obviously this violates the principle of privacy. Where is privacy if I don't know that you are watching me? I spend time with you. I'm not aware that I'm actually an object of your study, right? So if you're interested in studies like that, it might be a bit of a challenge to get informed consent. It's not impossible, but you really need to justify to the ethics board on why you need to do your study that way. All right, and this means for those who would go and immerse themselves in a particular community, it's usually called going native, taking on the values and morals of a particular group. So if you're going to go and spend a year or 2 years among people somewhere, obviously you need to understand what is acceptable and what is not, how people live and how people engage with each other in the world. So then obviously you will, to some extent, take on their values and morals. And then the issue of video recording, we spoke about that, and we were speaking about informed consent. Recording, if there's no informed consent, because you can't ask for informed consent because the person is not supposed to know that you are observing them. And if you can't ask for informed consent, then can you record without people's knowledge, right? So you see how concealed role of a researcher can be a challenge when it comes to issues of ethics. And then taking notes without then going back to do member check. So whatever you've written, whatever you say goes, because you can't check with people that you observed. Okay, and this can happen at 3 levels: conducting observations. Observations is not just about what you see. You don't describe just what you see, but also you note some nuances in terms of the interactions of people, right? So you describe what you observe, and also beyond just what you observe, right? You encourage not to make judgments or conclusions, but if you're observing, you need to come to certain conclusions. And again, in research, in qualitative research, we spoke about validating your data through trustworthiness, right? Where we check credibility and all of that. And often in concealed role of observation, that becomes difficult. But if you're doing observation and people are aware that you're observing, then you can engage and you can even check it with the people as well, right? So how you analyze observations, you're going to interpret what was observed. What is it that you observed? What does it mean? How do you make sense of it? What does it tell you about that particular phenomena that you were interested in that led you to the observation study? And so what does it mean, right? And how will what you found and your interpretation thereof assist us to get a better understanding, to broaden our understanding on that particular issue, right? And then reflection. Reflection is very important. What was the method that you used? How analysis was done? And then also ethical issues and problems around ethical issues. What happened along the way? And how did you engage and manage issues, maybe unintended things that happened along the way, right? Reactions of the observers. How did people receive you? How did people react to you? So reflecting on that other people seemed surprised, other people saw the stranger and they were interested in talking to me, other people were not interested. So reflecting on all those things, right? And then the need for further inquiry if needs be. All right. How do you note? You note while you're on site. If you're going to be there for a year, obviously not going to wait for a year before you start making notes. So you start making notes, you start writing and engage and putting down, noting all the things that you're observing as you observe. And then using technology such as video recording, and then just a checklist, the space where you're in, who are the actors, who are you observing, who are you not observing, and why. What are the activities that you observed? What are the things that are happening in that community? What objects are there, and what do they mean? How are they used? What is their role? What happens at what time, and why? And what are the goals of certain activities within the community? And just also feelings as well, your own, but also of people around you, and emotions that you've noted, and how people engage or embrace their emotions as well. So that's also very important. Some scholars also even make like a diagram of the place where they've been doing their observation to give a visual understanding. Okay, you go through this trouble because you want to gather live data. If you are an observation researcher, you want the information firsthand, right? And you want to also experience that context. Right, so you don't just want people's perception, but you also want to have the experience of what does it look like to be a member of that community, right? And then you may see what others unconsciously miss, because as people go about their business, they're not always consciously thinking about what's around them, what's happening. But as an observer with a particular purpose, you can be able to identify certain things, right? And also gaining access to things that are often not freely talked about in interviews. When people are going about their lives and it's part of what they do, you can pick up things that sometimes people would not necessarily share in interviews. So these are some of the things that make other researchers to do observation research. Okay, and then we also have visual methodologies. Visual methodologies have become quite popular in qualitative research. And so what are visual methodologies? Visual research is the qualitative research method or methodology that relies on artistic mediums, various artistic mediums, to produce and represent knowledge. So you don't just rely on text, you don't just rely on having a conversation with people, but you rely on the visual as well in terms of how knowledge can be represented. And this can be through film, can be through photography, can be through drawings, it can be through paintings. How do we make meaning of all of these? What are these paintings telling us about how people experience the world in a particular moment in time, in a particular context, and how is it used as a way to speak back to issues in society? What is this sculpture about, right? So this is what visual methodologies assist us to do. And so one of them is photo voice. Photo voice used quite a lot in psychology, in sociology, in many social science disciplines use photo voice. And here, power is given to the participant, right? So the participants are given a camera, often a disposable camera, and now with smartphones, people can use their smartphones to take these images. So images that are based on the accounts of their own lived experiences. You're interested in people's experiences of living in a particular community, of being from a particular school. There was a photo voice project that was focusing on being Black and being transgender in a context of the University of Cape Town. How does one feel welcomed or accommodated or excluded? And what are some of the markers that speak to this sense of belonging or not belonging, right? So through taking pictures of particular points within campus, particular spaces within campus, then one can be able to show how being in that space makes you feel alienated, or being in that space makes you feel like an outsider. And these are some of the markers, the visual things that actually make contribute to your feeling of alienation. And yeah. That's photo voice. And often then you would have a conversation as the researcher, in addition to the picture speaking 1,000 words without saying anything. You can also use the picture as a prompt to then have a conversation with the participant about the pictures that they've taken. And one of them could be, why these specific spaces? What do they represent? Why this particular area? Why this particular photo? What does it mean for you? What does it represent for you? Right? So over and above the narrative, you also have this visual that also then complements this narrative. And film, so people who also tell stories, do research using films, right? And what is it that films do? You document or film the subject, so it's used the researcher on the other side of the lens, documenting, telling a particular story, showing, or you use a film as a prompt. So you show a film to the subject and ask them questions or ask them opinions around film. So here you can also do multiple forms of methods of collecting data. So you can even use films in focus groups, for example. So earlier, I remember when I was talking about vignettes and using a story. So the story can be showing people a 10-minute film and saying, let's reflect on that film. Here are the issues that I would like us to speak about as they relate to the film. So that's one of the ways to do that. Or you can, again, just like photo voice, give the power to the participant for them to make a film and then have that film tell a story of their lived experience. Okay, I'll just pass on that. It's also just explaining how we can use film in qualitative research. And then we also have what is called photohistorias, right? It's again here, it's a variation of photo voice. So there are these multiple visual methodologies that are in place. And as the researcher, you can be creative, again, thinking about what are you focusing on? So photohistorias have been used mostly in studies around immigration, experiences of being a migrant person in a particular space. So, and from there, you can think about your own focus and say, but could photohistoria also be useful for the topic that I want to focus on as well, right? So understanding what photohistoria is and what it can assist you to do can then lead to you reflecting and saying, but is this useful or not? And so the idea, I'm bringing these to you to say, please go and read more on these. Please go and look at all these other possible ways in which you can collect data. Oftentimes, we always limit ourselves to interviews, right? You're going to conduct interviews, you're going to conduct focus groups. That's what we do. That's what we do in qualitative research. But there are all these other creative methodologies that we can use that are very helpful in assisting us to even delve deeper into the particular issue that we're interested in, right? Photohistorias, they can assist in eliciting multiple perspectives and symbols from the same image or place, right? As I said, something that you would not necessarily get if you're conducting interviews. So using this to be able to get multiple perspectives of a lived reality can be very important, right? Okay, and then the last thing that we're going to look at now before I pause and we go to questions is data analysis. Again, there's going to be a session that's going to be looking at the interpretation of your data, but I thought I could just start you off here so that you can start thinking about it, especially if you're working on your proposal and finalizing your proposal. What data analysis are you going to adopt and why? So just throwing it there. By the time you get to the session that's going to be speaking on data analysis and interpretation, that you already have this at the back of your mind, right? So there are different types of data analysis, again, in qualitative research, and many of them tend to be very interrelated. Many of them are born from each other, if I can put it that way, right? So there is we're interested in how do you make sense of this data? How do you make sense of this information that you've received for your participant? In what way are you going to now say, okay, what is this data saying to me, and how do I interpret it in a way that's going to assist us to get answers for the research question? So there's content analysis. We have grounded theory. And again, grounded theory, we discussed it on Tuesday. Grounded theory as a research design, and I've spoken about how grounded theory itself is a research design, but at the same time, it already incorporates data analysis in it. And of course, it assists you to come up with a broad theory on a particular issue. So grounded theory is a research design, but also grounded theory as data analysis in terms of how then one does that. And then we also have narrative analysis. When you've conducted your interviews, you've gotten the narratives from your participants. How do you then analyze that? And then discourse analysis, and then conversational analysis. Okay, literally going to fly through these. So content analysis, and this is something that again came up in our previous lecture, that you can do content analysis in qualitative research, you can do content analysis in quantitative research, quantitative and qualitative research. The focus is, what is it that you are looking at? What is it that you're hoping to achieve? And oftentimes with content analysis, especially for quantitative research, you'll find it in like communication studies, people in journalism, media, because you're looking at issues, you're looking at text, and you analyze text, and you're looking at the content of what people are saying and deriving meaning from that, right? So from the content analysis perspective, from a qualitative perspective, is that you develop themes on how many times, right? Because remember, with quantitative, we're interested in quantity. So how many times, right? How many times does a particular issue, idea reveal itself, right? So that relevant information that you're interested in, how often does it occur in the data that you've collected? So you count, and then you then be able to quantify, and then after quantifying, then you can code and then analyze that. But your analysis is going to be a statistical analysis of the quantified codes that you've come up with, right? Whereas in qualitative research, you're interested in capturing the meaning. You're interested in, what is it that we are told here? What is it that I'm hearing here, right? The latent meaning based on what a person is saying. So you're looking at the content, identify relevant data, you code it, and then you generate themes, right, from the content. And here's a quick example. In quantitative content analysis, I came across this example, which I thought was good. So the research is focusing on the importance of employment issues in political campaigns, right? You want to analyze campaign speeches for the frequency of terms such as unemployment and jobs and work. And you find those, and then you use the statistical analysis to look at the differences over time between candidates. So here our different candidates saying, vote for me, vote for me. I'm interested in issues of employment. Employment is an issue, and we know employment is an issue in South Africa a lot. So I'm going to be focusing on issues of employment. Issues are, and so that is the theme, that is the issue, right? And you say, okay, here's employment, here's this term. So in this political candidate speech, how many times do they talk about jobs, right? And how many times do they talk about work? How many times do they talk about unemployment as it relates to employment? So what are these variables that I'm getting here, that I'm counting here? So you do that, and then you do a statistical analysis to be able to tell, okay, that candidate from that political party is actually looking at employment in these ways. That candidate from that party is looking at unemployment in these ways, right? And then you can be able to then come up with an analysis and conclude that, okay, based on the number of times or the way in which this person has said this, we can conclusively then decide that that party feels this way about unemployment, right? And then the same in qualitative research, still interested in issues of unemployment, right? But how you're going to analyze it is going to differ, right? So you're looking at unemployment in the speeches of the candidates, and then you look at, okay, how are they looking at unemployment? What are the underlying things that what are their beliefs, right? And issues that they actually link unemployment with, right? So this one is looking at unemployment and the economy, looking at how unemployment is negatively affecting the economy, on how unemployment is not good for the economy, because these are the things that are linked to unemployment, right? And that candidate, that one, is looking at unemployment and how actually unemployment is an issue of inequality, right? So they come and they do a campaign and say, you know, there's issues of unemployment in this country because of the huge inequality that we have in this country, where other people have got access and others don't. And so you look at that and like, oh, okay. So they're interested in issues of inequality, and based on that, they are going to look at how to respond to issues of unemployment. And then you get another candidate that says unemployment is due to laziness. Many people are unemployed because they don't want to work, because they are lazy, right? So these are the things that are coming out. And so based on that content, then you can be able to analyze. So what is the meaning? So then it means this person is saying that people are lazy. So many people are struggling and they're suffering because of their laziness. So this could be one of the ways in which then you come to interpret this data based on looking at what they said and how they said it. All right. And then quickly, grounded theory, which we've already touched on, the different ways in which coding happens in grounded theory. Remember, we spoke about how when you're collecting your data in grounded theory, because you're building theory from the ground, is that you're already analyzing as you collect your data, you're interpreting, you're analyzing at different levels. So open coding is the process of breaking down, you examine, you compare, you conceptualize, and you categorize your data. So you've done your interview one, and then you look at the data that you got, and then you break it down, say, what are the issues that are coming up? What are the issues that are coming up in terms of themes? How do I put those together, right? And then you start categorizing them. And then with Excel coding, it's procedures where you put the data back together, right? After you've coded them in the open coding, by making connections now between the categories. So remember, in the first one, you looked at the data, you started categorizing. So maybe you've got like 20 categories. And then with Excel coding, you start making connections now between the categories that you've put together, right? And then selective coding, you select the core category. So from the 20, you start making connections, and then you say, what is the storyline? What is it that I'm hearing here, right? What is it that this data is telling us? What is the central issue? So that is where you get to selective coding, but you get there after you've done these others where you've put apart all these different codes. Okay, and then narrative analysis has got again different layers in terms of how you can analyze your data, right? An emphasis on what is it that the person is saying, how is the person saying what they're saying, right? And then you look at the structure in terms of where did they choose to begin their story, what is it that they've emphasized, right? So the structure of the story, right? If you think about a plot and think about a movie, and think about how the movie begins and how the movie ends. Some movies you find that at the end, at the beginning, they show you the end, and then the movie, and then the end is going to connect to the beginning. So how is the story structured, right? And then the interactions in terms of who is involved in the story, who forms part of my narrative, who forms part of my story. And then also the performative way in which people tell their story, right? The gestures that they use. Do they use their hands? Do they use their head? How are they using their body? So the performative way in which one tells the narrative is also very important in terms of how you analyze. So these would be the different steps in which you're going to analyze. Or you can say, in my work, I'm interested only in the structure, right? So for example, maybe you're doing a mini dissertation and you cannot really go broad as much as possible, but you always have to say, why are you using a particular analysis in the way that you're using it, right? And then discourse analysis. Discourse is verbal or written communication. Discourse is about the importance of context, right? So it's like content analysis, but it takes it even further. It's how language is used for us to be able to understand the social, cultural, political, and historical background of the discourse, right? So with content analysis, we spoke about the themes and the underlying meanings. And with discourse analysis, we're saying, how are these linked to our social reality? How are these linked to the cultural world? What is the role of history in how people come to view and understand the world as they do, right? So it's about how the meaning, the story, the experience is socially constructed. I tell my story based on my background. I tell my story based on the culture wherein I grew up, right? I tell my story based on the history that I come with. So those discourses and where and how and the context of telling the story is very important, right? So it's not just about what the person is saying, what you see, but what is it that I can understand about Puleng's history? I can understand about how Puleng views the world based on how she tells her story and what she chooses to tell, right? So discourse analysis it requires really in-depth engagement with the text, right? And it's interested in the ways in which power operates, right? So the issues of social justice, structural issues. So if you're interested in issues of healthcare, for example, you cannot say, oh, but the healthcare is very poor because the hospitals are very full because there are no resources, there isn't enough machines, and that you don't just end it there and say, oh, there are problems at that hospital because there aren't resources. And the experiences of the nurses is that they are exhausted and overwhelmed and overworked. And so it becomes difficult for them to perform their job. But you link it to issues of power. Why are there no resources? What are some of the issues at the higher systemic structural level that are impacting on how people are experiencing their work, right? So here central is the language. All right. How do we usually do analysis and qualitative research? Just a summary, it's inductive. You start from the specific to the broad. What is it that this story is telling me? And from this story, how can I understand more broadly the issue of health access in the country, right? So from the specific, from these experiences of people, I now get to understand issues around healthcare and healthcare challenges. And then ascribing codes, very important, whether you're doing thematic, content, narrative, it's important to code, it's important to have codes, excerpts, pieces of text from the person that you've interviewed, because it's important that it's not your voice that's privileged, but the voice of the participants. And the codes are going to be driven by the question. So when you transcribe, when you start categorizing, you do that in line with the research question that you have, right? Stay focused on your primary and specific questions and issues, and make sure that you cover the elements in your conceptual framework. So do you see how from chapter 1 to chapter 2 to your methodology, to how you make sense of the data, there is a weaving a narrative that flows, that even as you're now analyzing your data, you don't analyze your data outside of the literature that you've done. You don't analyze your data outside of the objectives and the questions that you've put up. Okay. So I'm going to stop here now and take a moment to engage with some of the questions that you may have. I'm just waiting for my computer to load the questions. They're not appearing yet on my side. I'm not sure if that means there aren't any questions, but okay, it's coming through. Okay. Dear Prof, if a participant, okay, let me stop sharing. Okay. If a participant has been approached to be interviewed and you do not hear from them, if they agree to be interviewed, is it advisable to follow up once or twice before one accepts that they do not want to be interviewed? Yes, remember when you're interviewing participants, it's always voluntary, right? And people's circumstances can change as well. So you may call and arrange for an interview for 2 weeks from now, but when that 2 weeks come, maybe circumstances might have changed and the person might not be willing, or they might not be available anymore, and so it might be difficult for you to then interview them. Then you'll consider maybe trying to approach somebody else. So it is advisable and it is acceptable to do follow-up. So you may follow up definitely when you do not hear back from the person who you contacted. But of course, if you've tried once or twice and you're not hearing from them, then maybe look for another participant. Okay. Is there a guideline for how many times to make observations? No, there is no guidelines. Remember, you're going to again be guided by what it is that you're interested in. So you can go and make your and make your observation. Obviously, you're not going to make an observation for an hour and then say, no, I've got enough for me to do the work. You go and you observe. You can give yourself a week, you can give yourself a month. It depends on, again, the type of observation that you're going to be using. Are you going to be a participant observer? Are you going to just be doing just observation without participating? Or are you going to be doing a little bit of both? All of those will determine how long you're going to take part. All right. So if you're a participant observer, you will take a bit of time in the community as you're observing in that particular place. So it could be 3 months, it could be a month. So there is no guideline as far as I know, Johannes. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. So what is the difference between focus group discussion and key informant interviews? Remember, key informant means something different altogether. So the key informants, you can do individual interviews with key informants. Key informants are people who have a stake in the particular community that you're going to, people who are knowledgeable perhaps, or people who have access to the people that you might be interested in accessing. Key informants could be people who have particular knowledge, as I said, in terms of what you're interested in. And you can do focus groups with key informants, right? You can do focus groups with people who are not key informants. So if you're doing a key informant interview, it's a specific type of interview, because this is a person, if let's say you're interested in getting an understanding of a particular cultural practice, right? So you will get someone who is knowledgeable in that specific cultural practice. And so you will do that interview with that person whom you'll then refer to as the key informant. Or you can have a focus group that focuses specifically or that involves key informants. So when we're talking about experts, so we can say it's a focus group that's focusing on experts on a particular issue, right? Okay, how can we address ethical procedures and where do we place it under methodology? Okay. Well, ethical procedures. First, what is your research about? What are you focusing on? Are you going to be looking at minors? Are you going to be looking at what's deemed as vulnerable populations? Are you going to be looking at so it depends on first your topic. It's going to depend on who you're hoping to have as your participants. So under methodology, there are different steps that you need to follow. First, you need to know which methodology you're going to use, right? So after deciding on which methodology you're going to use, because again, sometimes ethical implications do differ depending on whether you're doing a qualitative or a quantitative interview. We usually have more ethical considerations when we're doing qualitative research because of the close interaction that we have with people, and also because of the nature, the sensitive nature sometimes of the kind of information that we're requesting from people. So sometimes that does count as well. So how do we address them? It's important to think about what it is that your topic is aiming to get, right? It's an integral, ethical issues, an integral part of your methodology. They allow you to reflect on what are the possible ethical implications of this study, right? So you indicate, I'm going to do a qualitative study. And then you indicate, okay, I'm going to be doing structured interviews or unstructured, or I'm going to be doing observation. So because I'm going to be doing observation, there are certain ethical issues then that you would need to consider because of the research design that you've chosen, because of the data collection method that you've decided on. So all these are then going to then lead you to think in a particular way about your ethical procedures, right? So where do you place them? You place them after you've described and explained all these things, your design, your data collection, your selection criteria, how are you going to select people, who are you going to include, who are you going to exclude, and why. And all those things will then determine whether there are ethical, serious, or medium or less ethical issues to think about. So then you can be able to say, no, my study is actually medium risk, is high risk, or is low risk, based on those processes under your methodology that you would have chosen. I hope that makes sense. I'm clear on the focus groups, but what is the recommended number of participants for an in-depth interview in a qualitative study? Again, there are disagreements among many scholars on this, and I think where we all converge is the importance of saturation. Obviously, it depends on what it is that you're interested in. So if, for example, you're doing an autobiography, or you're looking at a single case, because sometimes a single case can be a person used as a case. So then you can use that as your participant, and but then you have to indicate why you've only chosen one person, right? But generally, let me now speak generally about what we often use. If you have 10 participants, if you have 15 participants, if you have 20 participants, those are acceptable. Sometimes 5 participants can also be found to be acceptable as well. It depends whether you're doing a master's or you're doing a PhD. You cannot do a PhD study and then interview only 5 people. And you have to really show why. The justification is very important. Why have you chosen this number of people? Right, because you need to already have an idea before you even collect your data. So the issue of saturation only comes later because you don't going to know that beforehand. So you need to make that decision. 5, 10, 15, 20 people. The quality of the work is what counts, because you can conduct 20 interviews, but you might find that your interviews are not very strong, very useful. The data is not actually assisting you to answer your question, right? So I would say aim for 10 to 15 people. You can interview some, their students or their people, their colleagues, their researchers. Sometimes people can interview as many as 100 people. Think about the time that you have as well. So if you are a student doing your master's, is it really feasible for you to interview 100 people? How long is that going to take you? And how long is that going to take you to analyze the data? You want to complete your study, and if it's a theme that you're really interested in, you can build on it for your PhD, you can build on it beyond your PhD. Right. So what's important is the quality and the in-depthness of the data that you've collected. And of course, be led by saturation. You can say in your proposal that you're intending to interview 20 people. But then, as the earlier question said, the participants, when you go and interview, you end up only interviewing 15, but you had indicated that you're going to interview 20. People can change their minds. People can decide, no, I'm not going to anymore. So sometimes having a considerable number of people assists you to accommodate for possible disappointments, such as when a participant says, no, I'm not interested anymore. So if you said, no, I'm going to be aiming for 30 people, knowing that if you get 18 or 20 people, you still have a sufficient number of people. All right. Okay. In data analysis, we've clearly explained that we need to reflect the conceptual framework. Yes. Are we allowed to include the concepts from the conceptual framework as the major codes during analysis? Yes, you are. But remember, you should not impose what's not there. So you can use those concepts after you've coded, you've categorized, and then you're coming up with themes. So how are those concepts assisting you in your analysis, right? So if your conceptual framework is very clear in how people have responded to your questions, then no, definitely. And again, as I said, all of these things are interlinked and connected. Even in how you come up with your themes, even how you categorize, it's always driven by the research questions that you have. It's always driven by what are these themes that are coming and how are these themes linked to the question that I have, right? But obviously all of that is going to be determined by the data itself. It has to come from the data. Is this data saying something about the conceptual framework? Am I picking up something that's linked to my conceptual framework here? And in that case, how do I then use my conceptual framework to make meaning of these concepts that I've come up with or that I've identified in my data analysis? Okay. I hope that helps. I'm going to go up. Charles, I'm not sure I understand the question. Can I interview more than one participant? More than one participant on the same issue at the same time? Okay, one participant on the same issue at the same time. More than one participant on the same issue. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yes. No. You can. We have what is called like maybe I'll call it dual, but like couple interviews. We have family interviews. We have like group interviews, but not necessarily focus groups, but group interviews where you are interviewing people, maybe 2 or 3 people on a particular issue, asking the same question, and they're all there at the same time. Yes, definitely. You can interview more than one participant on the same time, on the same issue at the same time. It has been done. It's also there in literature. So you're more than welcome to do that. There was one student recently, she interviewed members of the same family at the same time. So asking them the same questions, sisters, and they all responded from their own perspective and understanding, but they were all in the same room at the same time. So yes, definitely. Is it compulsory to record interviews? Really, it's not compulsory, but it's advisable, because the idea is that you want to go back to the data, or you want to go back to listen again, to hear what the person said. You want to go back to check whether what you heard is as you heard it, right? So, but it's not compulsory. So if you feel that you don't want to audio record your interviews, then by all means, you must just be very, very good in note taking, right? So, because sometimes some people don't feel comfortable, and sometimes maybe you as the researcher feel that you don't want to record the interview. You don't have to. You'll just make notes, and then what would be important is that immediately after the interview, you go and you sit down, you make notes on the issues that came up, you record everything. Manually, in this case, on what came on what came up. Sometimes it's your choice not to record. Sometimes it's the participant saying, I don't want to be recorded. Sometimes it's the circumstance that's making it difficult for the recording to happen. For example, if you're interviewing people who are incarcerated, when you go to such spaces, you would not be allowed to record, right? Okay, I think I've responded to that. How does one manage reluctant participants who don't want to be recorded? And possible identification through voice recognition. Definitely, that is a possibility. There are people who might feel that if I get recorded, even if I don't say my name, if someone really knows me and they listen to this, they can be able to tell that this is Buleng speaking here. And as a result, I don't want to be recorded. Maybe you're looking at employees that are not treated well in their working environment, and they want to speak as freely as possible, but they're worried about the implication of what they're saying should anyone hear, but they feel that it's important for them to express their experiences of working under the conditions that they're working in. So no, definitely. In that case, you just make notes. It just means, as I said, you must be a very good listener. Is it allowed or necessary to take pictures of participants during the interview? If yes, can they be used in the research work? Paul, yes. It is allowed with the permission of the participants, of course. And explaining that these images are going to form part of my report. These images I'm going to use in my write-up. And of course, now this links to that issue of anonymity, right? And using pseudonyms. So if I'm going to speak about anonymity, but then I'm going to have your picture in the report, what are the implications of that? Hence, it's very important for that conversation to happen and people understanding the implication of pictures being taken and pictures being used, right? So for example, if you, and again here, it's also linked to the type of research that you're doing. If you're doing collaborative research, action research, participatory action research, often you almost equals with your participants. You're generating the data together. You are thinking about the solutions on a particular issue. You are interpreting the data together. So in those types of research, it would be difficult for you to not acknowledge people and give them pseudonyms. So hence I'm saying it's very context-based, and it's also based on the research design that you're going to be using and your engagements with the people that you're going to be engaging with as well. So, but I have seen there are many studies. I'm sure you've seen some articles also have pictures of people where the author did the research. Pictures of the people from that community are there. Sometimes even in the thesis, the pictures are there. So it is possible. It is possible. You just need to make sure that the ethical issues around that are very clearly stated, right? And that when permission is given, that you also have that also recorded as well, or in writing, or as part of the consent form that as part of this data collection, I may or I would like to take photos, and these photos are going to be used in these particular ways. And if they've given you permission, then you are allowed to use them. Okay. If it is possible to send, should we send? I'm requesting 2 minutes. If it's possible to send the informed consent to the participant beforehand, yes, please do. That is allowed. I've been on the other side, I've been a participant in a number of studies, and they did send informed consent beforehand. So that is allowed. It's something that you can do. All right. And then when you start with the interview, you can obviously revisit and also just make sure that you are both on the same page. All right. Is it necessary to have all the supplementary questions and answers to reflect in the content of the research report? No, because remember, when you're probing, you don't necessarily know what the person is going to say when they respond. So probing is going to be based on how the person is responding. So if a person just gives a short answer, you can then probe so that maybe they tell you more on what they've just said. You can probing is often linked to following up on what a person is saying, or if a person just gives a short answer and you're interested in the elaboration of that, then you can ask. All right. So no, it's not necessary to have supplementary probing questions in the research report or proposal. Not at all. Does POPI affect interviews going forward? Anonymous, I'm not sure yet. It's not something that I'm aware of in terms of our research processes at the moment. And I think maybe it is a conversation now that POPI has been introduced to think about how it's going to affect issues of research and interviewing people and contacting people and getting contacts of people, right? So I think it's something that will need further engagement in terms of how it's going to affect research going forward. At the moment, nothing is in place that I know of, that I'm aware of in with regards to that. Okay. Okay. Ideally, you would not want to give the participants answers or questions before the interview. If you want it to be conversation like and flowing, but it's not something. It can be frowned upon, but it's not something that is not allowed. You may send questions. And then you can then have a conversation on those questions on the day of the interview. All right. Okay, because some people feel that they would like to reflect before they have the conversation, and so you can have that conversation after they've reflected on what you would like to talk to them about. But ideally, we often want it to be as natural as possible and not rehearsed. And also like free flowing, because even if you've given the questions, the idea of probing and follow up there could be a different direction in terms of how things unfold when you actually start having the conversation, because you may probe and ask follow-up questions based on the answers that they give you. All right. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for the generosity of your time. I really don't want to take more of your time. I'm aware of the other questions that you have. I'm so sorry that I could not respond to them right now. I'm hoping that in the other follow-up sessions that are going to be looking at issues related to data analysis, interpretation, issues again on qualitative work, that some of the questions that you're having today that I did not have time to respond to will be responded to. I do apologize for that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for attending this session, and all the best, all your best with your studies. And I look forward to engaging with you again in one of the future sessions that I'm going to be facilitating. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.